He's very sick. Don, run ahead, get everybody ready. Wait here. His blood pressure is falling.
We're losing him.
A boy from a small town in Nebraska died on a surgery table. But then something incredible happened. He came back to life after a few moments. Only he was not the same kid anymore, not even close. What felt like a few terrifying moments of death to the world was something completely different for him. It was an out-of-this-world experience, quite literally. The boy claimed he saw things, felt things, and learned things that nobody would believe. So what did he see? What exactly was this out-of-body experience?
It was a crisp spring morning in the small, tight-knit town of Imperial, Nebraska. The Burpo family's house was alive with the sounds of breakfast, a sizzling frying pan, the soft hum of morning radio, and the occasional playful giggle of 4-year-old Colton. He was the heart of their home, with his big blue eyes that seemed to sparkle with mischief and curiosity. His blonde hair always had a slight cowlick at the back, no matter how many times his mother, Sonia, tried to smooth it down. Colton was not just any 4-year-old. He was the kind of kid who left a trail of laughter and chaos wherever he went. One minute he was marching around the living room in his dad's oversized firefighter helmet, proclaiming himself Captain Colton, hero of Nebraska. And the next, he was trying to coax their old tabby cat, Smokey, into a baby stroller. Colton had a way of pulling people into his orbit, especially his dad, Todd, who could not help but indulge his son's wild imagination. Todd Burpo was a man of many hats, literally and figuratively. By trade, he was the pastor at their local church, but that was just one part of his busy life. He was also a volunteer firefighter, a high school wrestling coach, and a handyman for anyone in town who needed help fixing a leaky faucet or a wobbly fence. Despite his packed schedule, Todd made it a point to always be there for his family. He was the kind of dad who would drop everything to play catch in the backyard or help Cassie, Colton's older sister, with her math homework. Sonia, on the other hand, was the steady anchor of the family. As a school teacher, she was patient and fiercely protective of her children. She had a warmth about her that made every child in her class feel like they belonged. But underneath her calm exterior was a steel resolve that came out when her family needed her most. Together, Todd and Sonia had built a life grounded in faith, love, and community. Life in the Burpo household was hectic, but it was full of joy. That is, until the winter of 2003, when everything changed. It started as a regular winter cold, or so they thought. Colton had come down with a fever one evening after school, complaining about his stomach hurting. Sonia did what any mom would do. She pulled out the thermometer, gave him some Tylenol, and tucked him into bed early. She thought he would sleep it off, maybe miss a day of preschool, and bounce back like kids always do. But by the next morning, the fever had not budged, and Colton's complaints about his stomach turned into sharp cries of pain. At first, Todd tried to stay optimistic. He said to Sonia over their morning coffee that don't worry about it. He is tough. He can handle it. Remember when he scraped his knee last summer? Barely even cried. But Sonia was not convinced. There was something different about the way Colton was wincing, clutching his little belly with tears streaming down his cheeks. By the third day, Colton could barely sit up. Sonia decided it was time to see Dr. Miller, their family doctor. Dr. Miller had been practicing in Imperial for over 30 years. His waiting room, with its faded wallpaper and a stack of dog-eared magazines, was a familiar place for most families in town. He was the type of doctor who called everyone kiddo, no matter their age, and always had a reassuring smile. After a quick exam, he chalked it up to a stomach virus. He said that flu season is rough this year. Keep him hydrated, give him some rest, and he should be fine in a few days. Todd and Sonia were relieved to have a diagnosis. But as they left the clinic, Sonia could not shake the nagging feeling that something was not right. Over the next 2 days, things went from bad to worse. Colton's pain intensified. He could not keep anything down, not even water. His tiny frame laid curled up on the couch, pale and trembling. Sonia stayed by his side, wiping his forehead with a cool cloth, whispering words of comfort that she was not sure he could hear. Todd tried to hold it together, but the sight of his son in so much pain broke something inside him. One evening, while Sonia sat with Colton, Todd retreated to the garage. He slammed the door behind him, leaned against the workbench, and let out a deep, guttural cry. His hands trembled as he clutched a wrench. He did not know what to do. That's when he prayed to God and whispered, "Please just tell me what to do." Meanwhile, Cassie, who was 9 at the time, tried to stay out of the way. She didn't fully understand what was happening, but knew enough to sense the fear in her parents' voices. Late one night, she crept into Colton's room, holding her favorite stuffed animal, which was a floppy-eared bunny named Thumper. She placed it next to her brother, hoping it might comfort him. She brushed his damp hair off his forehead and whispered to him, "You can borrow him, just for tonight." On the 4th day, Sonia's instincts kicked into overdrive. Colton's cries of pain had turned into shallow whimpers. His skin was clammy, and his eyes were glassy. That's when she said, "Todd, we are taking him to the hospital. Now." The drive to Great Plains Regional Medical Center felt like an eternity. Todd gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, while Sonia sat in the back seat with Colton holding his hand and whispering prayers under her breath. When they arrived, the emergency room staff took one look at Colton and sprang into action. A nurse named Carol, who had a kind but no-nonsense demeanor, quickly assessed the situation. Within minutes, Colton was hooked up to IV fluids, and a series of tests were underway. Todd paced the waiting room like a caged animal, his mind racing through worst-case scenarios. Sonia sat hunched in a chair, clutching her phone, but too afraid to call anyone. What would she say? That her mischievous little boy was fading before her eyes? Finally, Dr. Andrews, a calm but stern pediatric surgeon, came out to speak with them. He told them that it was his appendix. It was ruptured, and the infection had spread. They needed to operate immediately. Sonia's knees nearly buckled at the news. Todd wrapped an arm around her, steadying her as the weight of the words sank in. A ruptured appendix? How had they missed it? The guilt was suffocating. They had waited too long and trusted that it was just the flu. Now their son's life was hanging by a thread. As Colton was wheeled into surgery, Sonia pressed her forehead against his and whispered, "I love you, baby," with tears streaming down her face. Colton was barely conscious at that moment. He gave her a weak smile. He said, "Love you too, Mommy," before the doors swung shut. The surgery was grueling. Hours passed as Todd and Sonia sat in the sterile waiting room. Sonia clutched a small wooden cross she kept in her purse, her lips moving silently in prayer. Todd, who had always been the rock of the family, was unraveling. He stared at the double doors, willing them to open and bring good news. Finally, Dr. Andrews emerged, his scrubs stained and his face lined with exhaustion. He said that Colton was stable, but it was close. His body had been through a lot. The next 24 hours were critical. Todd and Sonia clung to each other. They had made it through the first hurdle, but the fight was not over. That night, as Colton laid in the ICU, Sonia refused to leave his side. She watched the monitors beep steadily, each sound a lifeline. Todd sat in a chair by the window, staring out into the darkness. He didn't speak, but his thoughts were loud and relentless. What if they hadn't gotten there in time? What if Colton didn't pull through? Neither of them slept much that night. Every so often, Colton stirred, his tiny body fighting to recover. And though neither Todd nor Sonia said it out loud, they both felt it, a sense that something bigger was happening, something they could not quite understand. Little did they know, their boy was experiencing something extraordinary, something that would change their lives forever. The room was cold. Colton could feel it through the thin hospital gown that barely covered his small frame. The bright overhead lights made everything look sterile and strange, like a scene out of one of those doctor shows his mom sometimes watched on TV. He didn't fully understand what was happening, only that his stomach hurt so bad it felt like a monster was clawing at him from the inside. A woman in scrubs leaned over him and smiled. She said, "Hey there, buddy. We're just going to give you some medicine to help you feel better. I need you to count for me. Can you do that?" Colton's little hand twitched as he tried to grab at his dad's. But of course, he was not there. Colton didn't want to count. He wanted to go home, but he nodded. He began counting. 1, 2, 3. But before he could say 4, everything seemed to fade. The woman's voice, the bright lights, even the monster clawing at his belly, all of it vanished into a quiet, empty nothingness. At first, Colton thought he was dreaming. He was floating, light as a feather, above the operating table. The first thing he saw was himself, his own body lying still, pale and lifeless on the table. It was strange, like looking at a photograph of someone you barely recognized. His small chest rose and fell slightly, and the people around him moved with frantic urgency. The doctor, his forehead glistening with sweat, barked orders to the nurses. "We need to stabilize him, now." Colton blinked, or at least he thought he did. It was hard to tell, floating like this, weightless and free. He watched as the nurse adjusted machines, her face tight with concentration. It felt like a dream, but at the same time, it didn't. Everything was too clear, too vivid. The soft hum of the machines, the clinking of instruments being passed back and forth, it all felt real. He wanted to scream, "I am right here, I am okay," but no one looked up. They couldn't hear him. Then it hit him. He was not in his body anymore. The thought was not scary, not at first. It was just strange, like when you wake up in the middle of the night and don't quite remember where you are. He floated closer to the table, hovering over the scene. Was this really happening? Or was it just a really weird dream? He tilted his head, or at least it felt like he did, and decided to test his limits. Slowly, he drifted backward, through the walls of the operating room. The walls didn't stop him. He just moved through them, like air slipping under a door. It should have been impossible, but it wasn't. Colton found himself in the hallway outside. He saw his mom first. She was sitting in a stiff-looking chair, her phone pressed to her ear, her other hand clutching at the cross around her neck. She whispered into the phone, tears streaming down her face. "Please, please, pray for him." Colton's heart ached seeing his mom like that. He tried to say, "Mommy, don't cry." But again, no one heard him. A little further down the hall, his dad was pacing, his head bowed, hands clenched into fists. Colton could feel the fear and desperation radiating off of him like waves. He called out, "Daddy, I am okay," but the words dissolved into the stillness of the hallway. He drifted closer, trying to reach them, but before he could, something shifted. It felt like a gentle pull, tugging him upward, like an invisible hand guiding him. He was not scared, though. If anything, he felt safe, warm, like he was being carried by something he couldn't see but knew he could trust. The hospital faded away, and suddenly Colton found himself outside. The city below him looked tiny, like a toy set. He could see the cars on the streets and the people moving about their lives, completely unaware of the little boy floating far above them. He drifted higher and higher, the world shrinking beneath him, until it disappeared altogether. Colton was not sure how long he floated like that. Time didn't feel the same here. It stretched and bent in ways he could not explain. He passed through clouds, through a vast expanse of stars and galaxies that seemed brighter and more colorful than anything he had ever seen on Earth. He felt weightless, free, and unafraid. And then, as suddenly as he had left the Earth, he arrived somewhere else. It was brighter than anything he had ever seen, but it didn't hurt his eyes. The light was not just coming from one place. It was everywhere, glowing from everything around him. The air felt soft and warm, like a hug that wrapped around his entire body. He looked down and saw that he was not floating anymore. He could feel his feet again, and they were standing on soft, vibrant grass now. The colors were unlike anything he had ever seen. The grass wasn't just green, it shimmered with gold and silver, as though it were alive. Flowers bloomed in every color imaginable, their petals moving gently even though there was no breeze. Somewhere in the distance, he heard music, not like any music on earth, but something more beautiful, more complete. Like every sound in the world was perfectly in tune. And then he saw him. Colton didn't know how he knew, but he did. The man standing a little ways ahead of him was Jesus. He had brown hair that fell just past his shoulders and a beard that looked soft and warm. His eyes were the most striking thing, deep like oceans, filled with love and kindness that made Colton feel like he was the most important person in the universe. Jesus smiled at him, a smile so full of warmth that it made Colton's chest feel light. He said, "Hello, Colton." His voice was calm and gentle. It was not loud, but it felt like it filled the entire space. Colton asked, "Jesus?" His voice was small and uncertain. Jesus nodded and stepped closer. He said, "Yes, it's me." Colton stared at him, unsure of what to say. There were a million questions in his head, but none of them seemed right. So instead, he just stood there, soaking in the warmth of Jesus' presence. Colton asked after a long moment, "Am I dead?" Jesus crouched down, so he was at Colton's eye level. He said with a soft smile, "No, not yet. It is not your time. You have work to do back on earth." Colton blurted out, "But I don't want to go back. It hurts there." Jesus reached out and gently touched Colton's shoulder. He said, "I know, but your family needs you, and there is a reason you are here now. You will understand one day." Colton didn't understand, not completely, but somehow Jesus' words made him feel calm, like everything would be okay, even if he didn't know how or why. They talked for what felt like hours, though Colton could not remember all of it. He only knew that he didn't feel scared or alone anymore. Jesus told him things, important things, that Colton was not sure he would be able to explain when he got back. But he knew one thing for certain. Heaven was real, more real than anything he had ever known. Eventually, Jesus stood and smiled at him again. He said, "It is time for you to go back now." Colton didn't want to leave, but he felt that same gentle pull, the one that had brought him here. He glanced at Jesus one last time before the world around him began to blur and fade. When Colton opened his eyes again, he was back in the hospital. But he was not awake, at least, not fully. He could see his body lying on the operating table, still and fragile. The doctors were working frantically, their faces tense. He felt tired, so tired. He floated closer to his body and lay down beside it, curling up as though it were a soft bed. He felt himself being drawn back in, slipping into the small, fragile frame that he hadn't realized he missed. Everything went blank. That was the last thing Colton remembered before he woke up in the recovery room. But he knew, deep in his heart, that what he had seen was not just a dream. It was real. More real than anything he had ever experienced. He had been to heaven. He had met Jesus. And now, he was back. Colton's recovery seemed almost miraculous to everyone who saw him after his surgery. Physically, he bounced back faster than the doctors had anticipated. His energy returned slowly but steadily, and the color came back to his cheeks. But to Todd and Sonia, their little boy was not quite the same. He was quieter, more reserved, as if carrying a secret too big for his small frame. Sonia noticed the change first. Colton was not his usual curious, chatty self. He spent hours sitting by the window, staring out at the yard where he used to play. At first, Sonia thought he might be processing everything that had happened. The pain, the hospital, the doctors poking and prodding. She tried to comfort him, sitting beside him, reading him his favorite books, and telling him how brave he had been. But Colton remained distant, as though part of him was somewhere else entirely. Todd also saw the difference. When he would try to play games or joke around with Colton like they used to, the little boy would join in for a moment. But his laughter didn't have the same spark. Todd thought maybe it was due to exhaustion or the trauma of the whole ordeal. Maybe Colton just needed time. Still, there was something about the way he looked at things now. Serious, thoughtful, like he was seeing the world differently, that Todd could not quite put his finger on. Even Cassie, his older sister, noticed it. She tried to cheer him up, bringing him toys or sharing silly stories. But Colton would often sit quietly, watching her with a calmness that was unusual for him. Cassie eventually gave up, telling Sonia that Colton was acting weird. Sonia reassured her that he just needed rest. But deep down, she felt the same unease. Weeks passed, and Colton's health improved. But the change in his demeanor remained. He seemed thoughtful beyond his years, often lost in his own little world. Sonia and Todd tried to gently ask him about it. Did he remember anything from the hospital? Was he scared? Did he want to talk about it? Colton would always shrug, give a simple answer, or change the subject entirely. It was as if he was guarding something, holding it close to his heart. One day, while coloring at the kitchen table with Sonia, he casually mentioned that the hospital had been very bright. Sonia paused, caught off guard, but when she asked what he meant, Colton just smiled and went back to coloring. He didn't offer any more details, and Sonia didn't press him. She didn't know what to make of it, but she could not shake the feeling that there was more to his quietness than they realized. Life went on, and the family slowly settled back into their routine. Colton started playing with Cassie again, running around the yard and pulling their old tabby cat, Smokey, into his games. He smiled more, laughed more, and even asked Todd to take him on errands like they used to. But every so often, Todd or Sonia would catch him staring off into space, his eyes distant, as if he were remembering something. It was not until a Sunday afternoon months later that everything changed. The family had just returned from church, and Todd was in the garage fixing the lawnmower while Sonia folded laundry in the living room. Colton and Cassie were sitting on the floor, flipping through an old photo album that Sonia had brought out earlier. Cassie was asking about each picture, pointing to family members she didn't recognize. Todd walked in to join them just as Cassie pointed to a photo of a young man in black and white. It was an old picture of Todd's father, taken in his 20s. Todd explained that it was Pop, his dad, who had passed away long before Colton was born. That's when Colton surprised everyone. He looked at the photo and said he knew him. The statement was so casual that at first it didn't register. But when Todd asked him what he meant, Colton said he had seen Pop in heaven. Sonia, who had been folding laundry nearby, stopped in her tracks. She turned to Colton, her heart racing. How could he have seen Pop? Colton had never even met him. Colton explained that Pop had been there, and he was very happy to see him. He described the way Pop had hugged him and said he loved him. Sonia and Todd listened in stunned silence as Colton gave details about Pop that he couldn't possibly have known. He described how Pop looked, young, without his glasses, and with dark hair. The description matched photos of Todd's father from his youth, photos Colton had never seen. Todd felt a lump in his throat. The thought that his son had somehow met his father, a man he missed deeply, filled him with a mix of disbelief and overwhelming emotion. He could not explain it, but he also could not dismiss it. There was no way Colton could have made this up. The details were too specific and too personal. A few days later, Sonia was tucking Colton into bed when he said another shocking thing. He asked her if she had lost a baby. The question hit Sonia like a physical blow. Her hands trembled as she pulled the blanket up over him. Years before Colton was born, she had suffered a miscarriage, a loss so painful that she and Todd rarely spoke about it, even to each other. They had certainly never mentioned it to Colton. When Sonia asked why he was asking, Colton said he had met her. He explained that she was his sister and that she had told him she could not wait to meet their family in heaven. Sonia's heart broke and swelled at the same time. How could Colton know this? How could he be describing something so deeply personal, so deeply buried in her heart? Colton went on to describe her appearance. She had dark hair like Sonia, and she was very happy. He said she hugged him and told him how much she loved their family. Sonia could not hold back her tears. She sat by Colton's bed, overwhelmed by emotion she had not felt in years: grief, joy, and an inexplicable sense of peace. When she told Todd later that evening, he was just as shaken. The thought that their lost child was safe and happy in heaven, waiting for them, brought a sense of comfort they hadn't thought possible. But it also raised more questions. What exactly had Colton experienced? How could he know these things? Colton didn't seem to think his experiences were unusual. Over time, he shared more details, often in the middle of unrelated conversations. He described heaven as a place filled with colors more vibrant than anything on earth. The grass was alive, the flowers seemed to sing, and the air felt warm and safe. He spoke about a light that didn't come from the sun, but seemed to shine from everywhere at once. But the most profound moment came one evening while the family was sitting together in the living room. Colton turned to Todd and said he had seen Jesus. The words were simple, but they left everyone speechless. Colton described Jesus with a clarity that stunned Todd and Sonia. He spoke about his kind eyes, his warm smile, and the love that seemed to pour out of him. He said Jesus had brown hair and a beard and wore a white robe with a purple sash. He even mentioned the marks on Jesus' hands and feet, though he didn't seem to fully understand their significance. What struck Todd and Sonia the most was the way Colton talked about Jesus. It was not like he was describing a figure from a storybook or a Sunday school lesson. It was as if he were talking about someone he had actually met, someone who had left a deep impression on him. Colton also shared that Jesus had told him it was not his time yet. He said he had to come back because there was work for him to do. The words sent a chill down Todd's spine. He could not explain it, but he knew in his heart that his son was telling the truth. As Colton shared more about his experience, Sonia and Todd found themselves grappling with a mix of emotions. On one hand, they were overwhelmed by the beauty and hope of what Colton described. On the other hand, they could not fully comprehend it. How could their little boy have experienced something so profound? And why had it happened to him? Despite their questions, one thing was clear. Colton's experience had changed him. He was still the same mischievous, curious boy they had always known, but there was a new depth to him, a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. He spoke about heaven and Jesus with a certainty that left no room for doubt. And though his words often left Todd and Sonia speechless, they also brought them a sense of peace they had not felt in years. Colton's revelations about what Jesus told him came slowly, shared in pieces over time. But each detail carried immense weight, shaping not just his parents' understanding of what had happened, but their entire perspective on life, faith, and the world around them. When Colton told them what happened that day, they realized that Jesus' words were not just simple phrases. They were profound truths layered with meaning. One of the first things Colton shared was how much Jesus loves every single person. Colton didn't just say it like a child repeating a lesson from Sunday school. He described it as if he had felt that love, like it had surrounded him and filled him up completely. He explained that Jesus' love was not like the love people shared on earth. It was not conditional, based on behavior or actions. It didn't waver or weaken. It was constant, overwhelming, and entirely unconditional. Jesus, he said, especially loved children. Colton spoke about how Jesus had made him feel special, like he was the most important person in the universe at that moment. But at the same time, he said, Jesus' love was not just for him, it was for everyone, no matter who they were, what they had done, or where they came from. Colton explained that this love felt like light, wrapping around him like a warm blanket. It was so intense and complete that it wiped away all fear, sadness, and pain. Jesus, he said, didn't just tell him about love. He was love. Every part of him radiated it, and it was impossible not to feel completely safe and valued in his presence. Sonia and Todd were deeply moved by this. They had always believed in the love of Jesus, but hearing their little boy describe it in such vivid terms made it feel real in a way it never had before. It was not just something they read about in scripture or sang about in hymns. It was alive, tangible, and all-encompassing. Another message Jesus shared with Colton was that life on earth has a purpose. Colton told his parents that Jesus had explained to him why he could not stay in heaven, even though it was such a beautiful and peaceful place. According to Colton, Jesus said it was not his time yet, because there was still work for him to do on earth. Colton didn't fully understand what that work was, but he knew it was important. Jesus had made it clear that every person on earth has a role to play, even if they don't always know what it is. Colton said Jesus told him that people often get caught up in their daily struggles, forgetting that their lives are part of a much bigger plan. Every act of kindness, every moment of love or compassion fits into that plan like a puzzle piece. Colton's words left Sonia and Todd thinking deeply. They had always taught their children that God had a plan for their lives, but hearing it from Colton, who spoke with such certainty, gave those teachings new weight. Todd found himself reflecting on his role as a pastor. Was he fulfilling his purpose? Was he doing the work he was meant to do? Sonia, too, began to see her life in a different light, realizing that even the small, everyday acts of love and care she showed her children were part of something greater. Colton's story was not just about him. It was a reminder to everyone who heard it that their lives mattered, even in ways they couldn't yet understand. Then, one of the most comforting things Jesus told Colton was about loved ones who had passed away. Colton shared with his parents how he had met his grandfather, Pop, in heaven. Pop had been young and full of life, and he had told Colton how proud he was of his family. But more than that, Pop had assured Colton that he was happy, safe, and waiting for the day they would all be together again. Colton also spoke about meeting his unborn sister, the child Sonia had lost to miscarriage years before. She had told Colton how much she loved their family and how excited she was to meet them someday. Colton explained that she was not sad or lonely. She was surrounded by love and joy, just like everyone else in heaven. Jesus had shown Colton that heaven was a place where no one felt pain or sadness. People there were whole, happy, and at peace. There was no sense of loss or separation, only the joy of being with those they loved. Jesus had reassured Colton that even though life on earth can be hard and filled with grief, those who believe will be reunited with their loved ones one day. For Sonia and Todd, this was perhaps the most profound part of Colton's story. It brought them a deep sense of comfort, especially when they thought about the child they had lost. It reminded them that even in their darkest moments, their faith was not in vain. Jesus also told Colton that death was not the end. Colton described how Jesus had explained that life on earth was only the beginning of a much larger journey. He said that heaven was not just a place people went to after they died, it was home. It was where they truly belonged. Colton shared how Jesus had shown him the beauty of heaven, a place filled with colors and music unlike anything on earth. He described how everything there seemed to glow with its own light, as if the love and joy of the place were woven into its very fabric. The flowers, the trees, the sky, all of it felt alive and harmonious. Colton said it was impossible to feel fear or sadness there. Instead, there was a deep sense of peace and belonging. Jesus had told Colton that this was the hope people needed to hold on to, especially during life struggles. He said that even though life on earth could be hard, filled with pain, loss, and uncertainty, it was important to trust in the greater plan. Jesus wanted people to know that no matter how dark things seemed, they were never alone. He was always with them, guiding them towards something better. Colton also shared that Jesus had talked to him about the power of prayer. Jesus had explained that prayer was not just about asking for things, it was about building a relationship. Colton said that Jesus loved when people talked to him, even if it was just to share their thoughts or ask for guidance. Jesus wanted people to know that he was always listening, even when they felt like their prayers were not being answered. Colton explained that Jesus had shown him how prayer could bring comfort and strength, even in the hardest moments. It was a way for people to feel connected to him and to remember that they were never alone. Sonia found herself reflecting on this deeply. She had prayed so many times during Colton's surgery, pleading for God to save her son. Hearing Colton talk about how much Jesus valued those prayers made her feel as if every word she had whispered had been heard. One of the things that stood out most to Colton was how much Jesus loved children. He told his parents that Jesus had explained to him that children held a special place in heaven because of their innocence and pure hearts. Colton described how Jesus had surrounded him with love, making him feel completely safe and cherished. He said that Jesus wanted all children to feel loved and protected, not just in heaven, but on earth too. Colton's words left Todd and Sonia deeply moved. As parents, they had always tried to give their children a sense of love and security. But hearing Colton talk about how Jesus cherished children made them realize just how important that role was. It was not just about raising good kids. It was about showing them the kind of unconditional love that reflected Jesus' love for them. Colton also shared how Jesus had talked to him about gratitude. He said Jesus wanted people to appreciate the life they were given and the blessings they had, even when things were difficult. Jesus had told Colton that gratitude does not mean you just have to say thank you for the good things. It means you have to find joy in every moment, even the small ones. Colton explained that Jesus had shown him how much people on earth take for granted: the beauty of a sunrise, the laughter of a child, the love of a family. Jesus wanted people to slow down and truly see the blessings around them. This struck a chord with Sonia and Todd, who realized how often they got caught up in the busyness of life without pausing to appreciate the simple, beautiful moments. Finally, Colton shared that Jesus had emphasized the importance of love above all else. Jesus had told him that love was the greatest commandment, the one thing that truly mattered. Colton explained that Jesus didn't just mean love for family or friends, but love for everyone, even those who are difficult to love. Colton said Jesus had shown him how powerful love could be, how it could heal wounds and bring people together. He described how love was not just a feeling, but an action, a choice to be kind, forgiving, and compassionate, even when it was hard. Todd and Sonia were deeply moved by this, realizing that everything they believed about their faith came back to this one simple truth. As Colton shared these messages over time, Sonia and Todd could not help but feel a sense of awe. Their little boy had experienced something extraordinary, something that had changed not just him, but their entire family. Jesus' words were a reminder of the love, purpose, and hope that existed beyond the struggles of life on earth. For the Burpo family, Colton's Colton story was a message meant to be shared, one that would bring comfort and inspiration to countless others. So, yes, the family decided to go for it. They decided to share the story with the world. It was a Sunday morning, a quiet day in Imperial, Nebraska. The Burpo family sat together in the front pew of the small church where Todd had been preaching for years. Normally, Todd would feel calm before delivering his sermon, But today, his heart was racing. He kept adjusting his tie, glancing at Sonia, who gave him a reassuring smile. She could sense his nervousness. After all, they had decided to do something they had never done before. They were going to share Colton's story with the congregation. For months, Todd and Sonia had kept Colton's experiences private. It wasn't that they doubted him. How could they, with the incredible details he had shared? But it was such a deeply personal story, and they were not sure how people would react. What if they didn't believe them? What if they thought it was all a lie? These questions had kept Todd awake at night, pacing the living room while Sonia quietly prayed for guidance. So Todd stood behind the pulpit, gripping the edges with both hands, as he looked out at the familiar faces of his congregation. These were people he had known for years, people who had come to him for comfort and guidance in their darkest moments. But today, he was not sure how they would receive what he was about to share. He cleared his throat, his voice steady despite the lump forming there. He said that he wanted to talk to them about something personal that day, something that had changed his family's lives forever. Todd spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully as he described Colton's health crisis, the terrifying moments in the hospital, the surgery, and the miraculous recovery. He could see the congregation leaning in, their expressions shifting from concern to curiosity. Then, with a deep breath, he began to share what Colton had told them about the colors of heaven, the people he met, and the words Jesus had spoken to him. There was a collective stillness in the room, a kind of quiet that felt almost sacred. Sonia sat in the pew, her hands tightly clasped, her eyes darting nervously to the faces around her. She could not tell what people were thinking. Were they moved? Were they skeptical? Todd continued, his voice growing steadier as he described Colton's encounters with his grandfather and his unborn sister. When he finally finished, there was silence for a few moments before a single voice broke through. An older woman stood up in the back and said, "Thank you for sharing that." It was Mrs. Henderson, a widow who had lost her husband the year before. Todd saw her wiping tears from her cheeks, and for the first time that morning, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. After that, word spread quickly. In a small town like Imperial, news traveled faster than the church bulletin could keep up. By the following Sunday, the pews were more crowded than usual. People who had not been to church in months showed up, curious to hear more about what Colton had seen. After the service, Todd and Sonia were swarmed with questions. What did Colton say heaven looked like? Did he describe Jesus? How could they be sure he was not dreaming? Sonia answered as best she could, but it was not easy. Some people were genuinely moved, while others seemed hesitant, as if they were not sure what to believe. But one thing was clear. Colton's story had struck a chord. It gave people something they didn't realize they were searching for. It was hope. Not everyone was supportive, though. As the story spread beyond their small church, whispers of skepticism began to surface. At first, it was subtle. There were comments from acquaintances at the grocery store, a few raised eyebrows during church meetings. But soon, the doubts became more vocal. One evening, Todd received a phone call from a fellow pastor in a neighboring town. The man's tone was polite, but firm as he questioned the validity of Colton's story. He asked, "You are sure this isn't just a vivid imagination? Children can be impressionable, especially with parents in ministry." Todd's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. Then he said he knew his son and that he was not making that up. The doubts didn't stop there. A few members of the congregation stopped attending services altogether. They cited concerns that Todd was sensationalizing his family's experiences. Sonia took the criticism hard. She hated the idea that people thought they were using Colton's story for attention. She spent long nights lying awake, worrying about how this would affect her son. She kept thinking, what if this was too much for him? What if they were putting him under a spotlight he was not ready for? She asked the same things from Todd. Todd didn't have an answer. All he knew was that they had to trust that sharing the story was the right thing to do. For every doubter, though, there were 10 people who found solace in Colton's story. Letters began arriving at the church office, some from neighbors, others from people Todd and Sonia had never met. A young mother wrote about how she had recently lost her child and had been struggling to hold on to her faith. She wrote that Colton's story gave her hope. It made her believe that her little boy was safe and happy in heaven. One afternoon, an elderly man approached Todd after the service. His hands trembled as he spoke. He had not prayed in years. He had lost his wife a decade ago, and he couldn't understand why God would take her from me. But then he said that what Colton had described made him think maybe his wife was okay after all. Moments like these reassured Todd and Sonia that they were doing the right thing. They saw how Colton's story was bringing comfort to people who were grieving, people who had lost their faith, and people who were searching for meaning. Then they decided to write a book. It was Sonia's idea to write the book. She brought it up one evening as they sat at the kitchen table, Colton doodling on a piece of paper nearby. She said that they could not keep that to themselves. There were so many people who needed to hear this. Todd hesitated. The thought of putting their family's story out into the world felt overwhelming. What if people thought they were doing it for the money? Sonia said that it was not about that. It was about the message. It was about giving people hope. Todd mulled it over for days before finally agreeing. They began writing the book together, spending long nights at the kitchen table, piecing together the story bit by bit. Colton often sat with them, chiming in with details or correcting them when they got something wrong. He would say, "It was not just bright, it was really bright, like nothing you have ever seen." When the book, Heaven is for Real, was finally published, Todd and Sonia were unprepared for the response. Within weeks, it became a bestseller. Letters poured in from across the country, and their small town suddenly became the center of attention. Reporters started calling, asking for interviews. It was both exciting and nerve-wracking. Then came the interviews. The first interview was with a local news station. Todd wore his best suit, and Sonia spent an hour fussing over Colton's hair, trying to get his cowlick to behave. Sitting under the bright studio lights, Todd felt a familiar nervousness creep in. But when the reporter started asking questions, Colton's calm, matter-of-fact answers stole the show. He spoke about meeting Pop, about the colors of heaven, and about Jesus' love, with a sincerity that left the reporter speechless. Todd and Sonia watched in awe as their little boy, who had once been so shy, seemed completely at ease sharing his story. As the interviews continued, so did the scrutiny. National media outlets picked up the story, and while many were supportive, some were not. Critics questioned the authenticity of Colton's experience, suggesting it could be explained by the effects of anesthesia or a vivid imagination. Online forums dissected every detail, with skeptics accusing the Burpos of fabricating the story for profit. Sonia struggled with the negativity. She avoided reading the comments, but Todd could not help himself. Late at night, he would scroll through forums, his jaw tightening as he read the accusations. He knew the truth, but the constant doubt weighed heavily on him. Through it all, Colton remained unfazed. He didn't seem to notice the controversy forming around him. To him, he was just telling the truth. He didn't try to convince anyone or argue with skeptics. He simply shared what he had seen and let people make up their own minds. Todd and Sonia took their cue from Colton. They stopped trying to defend themselves and focused on the people who found comfort in their story. They continued to speak at churches and community events, sharing the message of hope and love that Colton had brought back with him. One evening, after a particularly challenging interview, where the host had pressed Todd on the scientific explanations for near-death experiences, he returned home feeling defeated. He found Colton in the backyard, playing with his toy truck. Sitting down beside him, Todd let out a heavy sigh. Colton asked him, "Are you okay, Daddy?" He looked up at him with those big, innocent eyes. Todd forced a smile and said, "Yeah, buddy, I am okay." Colton nodded, as if he understood more than Todd realized. He said that Jesus had told him it was real. He said heaven was real. In that moment, Todd felt a wave of peace wash over him. It didn't matter what the critics said. It didn't matter how many people doubted. What mattered was the truth of what Colton had experienced and the hope it brought to so many. Life after Colton's extraordinary experience was nothing like the Burpo family had expected. Their once quiet existence in Imperial, Nebraska was transformed into something they could not have imagined. While they tried to return to normal, nothing really felt normal anymore. Their days were filled with both profound gratitude for Colton's survival and an unshakable awareness that their lives had been touched by something far greater than themselves. At first, the family thought things would eventually settle down. Todd returned to his role as pastor at their small church, and Sonia resumed her teaching job. Colton started school again, and Cassie went back to her usual routine. But even as they tried to go about their lives, there was a new weight in the air, a combination of awe, responsibility, and the ripple effects of Colton's story. Todd, who had always been a practical, hands-on guy, found himself more reflective than ever. The man who could fix just about anything, like a leaky faucet, a broken fence, a church budget stretched too thin, was now wrestling with questions that didn't have easy answers. He would spend hours in his office at the church, staring out the window at the open Nebraska plains, thinking about the enormity of what his son had shared. He started adding more personal stories to his sermons, weaving Colton's experience into his messages about hope, faith, and the promise of heaven. His congregation, which had always appreciated his straightforward, no-frills approach, now hung on his every word. Todd could feel the shift. People were searching for something deeper, something that Colton's story seemed to awaken in them. Sonia, meanwhile, found herself busier than ever. She was already juggling her role as a teacher and mother, but now she had become a confidant for countless people in their community. Strangers would approach her in the grocery store or after church, their faces lined with grief and hope. They wanted to hear more about Colton's story, yes, but more than that, they wanted reassurance. There was the elderly woman who had lost her husband of 50 years and could not bear to walk into their bedroom alone at night. The young mother had buried her infant daughter and had not slept a full night since. The teenage boy had lost his best friend in a car accident and was drowning in guilt over the fight they had had the week before. Sonia listened to them all, her heart breaking and healing a little more with each story. She offered them words of comfort, drawing from the hope she had found in Colton's experience. For Colton, life after heaven was both simple and extraordinary. He was still just a little boy, excited to play with his toys, run around outside with Cassie, and tug at Smokey the cat's tail when no one was looking. But there was something about him that felt different, not just to his parents, but to anyone who spent time with him. People would often say he had an old soul, though they could not quite put their finger on why. Maybe it was the way he seemed to really see people when they spoke to him, his big blue eyes locking onto theirs with an intensity that felt almost otherworldly. Or maybe it was his calmness. While most kids his age were bouncing off walls, Colton had a way of being still, of listening that made people feel like he understood more than he let on. At school, Colton's teachers noticed the change too. He was quieter than before, but not withdrawn. If anything, he seemed more thoughtful, often staring out the window during lessons as if he were watching something no one else could see. During recess, he played with the other kids, but he had a way of stepping in when arguments broke out, diffusing tension with a kindness that seemed beyond his years. Sonia and Todd worried about how Colton might handle the attention his story was bringing, but he remained unaffected. When people asked him questions about heaven or Jesus, he answered simply, without hesitation, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. And when they didn't ask, he didn't bring it up. To him, what he had experienced was just the truth, and he didn't feel the need to prove it to anyone. The impact of Colton's story spread far beyond their small town. Families from neighboring communities began showing up at their church, sitting in the back pews and waiting patiently to talk to Todd or Sonia after the service. Some came with heavy questions. Why had they lost their loved ones? Why did some survive while others didn't? Others came with gratitude, saying Colton's story had renewed their faith or given them hope in the face of unspeakable loss. Years later, the Burpo family still feels the ripple effects of Colton's experience. Colton, now an adult, has continued to grow into a kind, thoughtful man. While he no longer speaks about heaven as frequently as he did as a child, the experience remains a foundational part of who he is. He has built a life centered around helping others, driven by the sense of purpose he felt when Jesus told him he had work to do. Cassie, now grown, has found her own path as well. She often reflects on how her brother's journey shaped their family, teaching her about resilience, love, and the importance of faith. She still journals, filling page after page with her thoughts and dreams, and she finds joy in helping others in her own quiet way. For Todd and Sonia, life has slowed down a bit. The flurry of attention has faded, leaving them with more time to focus on their family and their community. Todd continues to preach, his sermons infused with the wisdom and hope he has gained from their journey. Sonia remains a steady presence in the lives of those around her, always ready with a listening ear and a kind word. Together, they look back on everything they have been through with a deep sense of gratitude. Colton's story is more than an account of a little boy's miraculous journey. It is a reminder of the depth of our shared humanity. It challenges us to think about life, love, faith, and what might come after. For those who hear it, the story brings something rare: hope in the face of the unknown. We live in a world that can feel heavy, filled with loss, grief, doubt, and fear. Yet stories like Colton's remind us that even in the darkest times, there's light to be found. And maybe, just maybe, something far greater waiting for us. As you think about this story, it is impossible not to reflect on your own life. Have you ever experienced a moment that made you stop and wonder if there is more to this existence than what we see? Maybe it was a loss that left you searching for answers, or a small, almost inexplicable feeling of connection to something larger than yourself. That's what Colton's story does. It stirs something deep within us, making us ask questions we might not usually have the courage to confront. One of the most amazing things about Colton's experience is the love he described. Not the fleeting, imperfect love we often encounter in our daily lives, but a love so complete, so overwhelming that it filled every part of him. It is a love that didn't demand anything of him, didn't require him to be good enough, strong enough, or anything enough. It just was. Can you imagine feeling that kind of love? A love that wraps around you like a warm blanket, telling you that you are enough just as you are. What would it look like if we tried to bring even a fraction of that love into our own lives? Maybe it is as simple as forgiving someone who hurt you or reaching out to a friend who is struggling. Maybe it is choosing to show kindness to a stranger or patience to someone who is testing your last nerve. Imagine the ripple effect if each of us carried a little more love into the world. It might not look as grand as the love Colton described, but it is a start. And then there is the idea of purpose. How often do we rush through our days, consumed by to-do lists and responsibilities, without pausing to consider why we are here? Colton's story reminds us that every life has meaning, even if we don't always see it. It is not just about the big, dramatic moments. It is about the little things, too. The words we speak, the actions we take, the love we share. They all matter. Think about the moments in your life that have left a mark. Maybe it was a kind word from a teacher when you were struggling, or a hug from a friend when you felt alone. Those moments may have seemed small at the time, but they carried weight. They mattered. That's what Colton's experience teaches us, that every interaction, every decision, every bit of kindness contributes to something bigger than ourselves. It is also hard to ignore the way this story challenges us to think about loss. If you have ever lost someone you love, you know the ache that comes with it, the questions that swirl in your mind late at night, the emptiness that settles in your chest when you think about the memories you will never make with them. Colton's story does not erase that pain, but it offers a balm, a gentle reassurance that maybe, just maybe, they are not as far away as they feel. Colton's encounters with his grandfather and unborn sister are a particularly powerful reminder of this. For those who have lost loved ones, the idea that they are safe, happy, and waiting for us can bring immense comfort. It does not take away the grief, but it reframes it. Instead of being consumed by what's lost, we can hold on to the hope of what's to come. But what about the doubts? It is natural to question something like this. After all, how can we truly know what lies beyond this life? Skepticism is not just understandable, it is human. Yet, as you hear Colton's story, it is hard not to feel something stir within you. Maybe it is a quiet whisper of hope, or a tiny spark of belief that refuses to be extinguished. Faith does not require certainty. It asks us to trust, even when we don't have all the answers. Faith, in many ways, is like walking in the dark with a small flashlight. You cannot see the entire path ahead, but you can see just enough to take the next step. Colton's story is one of those moments that shines a light on the path, reminding us that we don't have to see the whole picture to keep moving forward. And what about the children? Colton described a special love Jesus had for them, a love that cherished their innocence and wonder. It reminds us that children see the world differently, with eyes unclouded by cynicism or doubt. And yes, there is the ultimate question. What happens when we die? It is the question that has haunted humanity for as long as we've been able to think about it. Colton's story does not claim to have all the answers, but it gives us a glimpse of colors more vibrant than we can imagine, of music that is not just heard, but felt, of a love so overwhelming that it leaves no room for fear. Death is something we all face, yet it is something we rarely talk about openly. We push it to the edges of our minds, hoping to avoid its shadow for as long as possible. But stories like Colton's remind us that death is not the end. It is a transition, a doorway to something more. What would it mean to live with that kind of hope? To approach each day not with dread of what's to come, but with gratitude for the moments we have been given? Perhaps the most profound lesson of all is this: we are not alone. Whether you believe in heaven or not, there is something deeply comforting in the idea that we are part of something greater, that our lives, no matter how small they may feel, are connected to a vast, intricate tapestry we can't fully see. Colton's story reminds us that we are seen, we are loved, and we are never truly alone. So, what do we do with this story? Maybe we don't have to figure it all out. Maybe it is enough to let it sit with us, to let it challenge and inspire us, to let it remind us to love a little more deeply, to live with a little more purpose, and to hold on to hope, even when life feels overwhelming. So, what about you? What was the biggest lesson that you learned from this story? Tell us in the comments below. Before you go, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more stories like this. Thanks for watching.